Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely.
Awesome. So today we're tackling something pretty big, capitalism.
Ooh, yeah.
We're going to be looking at this book called What Went Wrong with Capitalism. It's getting a lot of buzz, especially, with younger folks who are kind of feeling like the system.
Isn't really working for them.
Exactly. It's interesting, right? Because on the surface, it seems like capitalism has done a lot of good. I mean, there's so much wealth and innovation around us.
Right, right. And that's exactly what makes this book so fascinating. The author actually starts by looking back at his own life, comparing his experiences with different economic systems.
So he's kind of seen both sides of the coin.
Yeah, like growing up in India in the 70s, back then it was all about socialism.
Okay.
He describes like a country really struggling under government control, businesses mostly run by the state, industries all nationalized,
I see.
a huge welfare system, but the economy just couldn't support it. Slow growth, shortages of basic goods, incomes going down.
Wow. Not exactly the picture of success we usually think of with capitalism.
Nope, not at all.
Can you give us a real-world example of what this looked like for people?
Sure, imagine trying to get a phone line installed back then.
Okay,
You could be on a waiting list for months, even years.
seriously.
Yeah. And that lack of opportunity, it was a big part of that system. But then the author moves to Singapore in the 80s. Total opposite.
How so?
Well, Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew, they were all about low taxes, minimal government, open markets. Their economy boomed, incomes went way up.
Huh. So they were like the poster child for free market success.
Exactly. And the author, seeing these two systems firsthand, it definitely shaped his views. Then he ties this into the American boom under Reagan.
Right, the whole deregulation era.
Yeah. He actually admires that period, which kind of sets the stage for when he goes back to India in the 90s.
What was happening in India then?
Well, India, as a democracy, had political freedom, but their economy was still really controlled, holding them back. And then comes 1991, the financial crisis feels like a turning point in the story. It is. Years of government overspending had finally caught up with them. The country was on the verge of collapse.
Yikes.
Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had started to open up the economy a little, but
But,
he was assassinated.
oh wow.
Yeah, tragically, before he could really implement more drastic reforms.
So what happened next?
His successor, the finance minister Manmohan Singh, he knew they had to act fast.
Yeah.
He led a series of economic reforms to try to pull India back from the brink.
What kind of reforms?
Things like loosening the government's grip on the economy, cutting bureaucracy, trying to attract foreign investment.
So basically trying to shift towards a more free market approach.
Right. And it did work. The economy started to recover, but there was a lot of resistance to these reforms.
I see.
And that slowed things down. The author points out that countries like China and South Korea, they really embraced free markets and saw much faster growth as a result.
Interesting. The book also mentions that India made a big mistake expanding welfare programs before they had a really solid economy.
Right.
Is that something we see happening in other places too?
Yeah, for sure. The author argues that doing that, expanding social spending before the economy is strong enough, it actually takes resources away from things like infrastructure, education, healthcare, those things that are really essential for long-term growth.
Right. It's like putting the cart before the horse.
Exactly. And it's a debate we're seeing play out right now in lots of developed countries, too.
Makes you think. So while India was trying to figure things out, what was going on in places like the US, Europe, Japan? Were they sticking to free market principles?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But actually, it's been the opposite. There's been a steady trend toward bigger government in those countries.
Really?
Yeah, going all the way back to the 1930s with Roosevelt's New Deal in America. Even Reagan, who's often seen as a champion of free markets, couldn't completely reverse that.
Huh.
He slowed it down, sure, but the overall direction stayed the same. And today, you even see some right-leaning politicians advocating for more government control in certain areas of the economy.
It's almost like we're caught in this tug of war between free markets and government intervention.
And the rope keeps moving towards the government's side.
That is fascinating. It seems counterintuitive that government intervention would be on the rise in countries known for capitalism.
I know, right? And that's where the book really challenges the conventional wisdom. We usually hear that free markets lead to inequality and the solution is more government.
Right.
But the author flips that on its head. He says it's actually all that government meddling in the market that causes a lot of our economic problems.
Whoa. So he's saying government intervention, not capitalism itself, is to blame for a lot of the economic struggles people are facing.
That's exactly what he's arguing.
Okay, I got to hear more about this. How does he explain that? Like, what kind of government interference are we talking about, and how does it actually affect things?
Well, he starts by talking about Reagan's regrets about the growing government debt during his time.
Interesting.
Even Reagan, with all his free market talk, saw government spending go up, fueled by borrowing.
Right.
And the author uses this to lead into what he calls capitalism's debt addiction.
Debt addiction. That sounds serious.
It is. He's talking about this massive increase in debt everywhere over the last few decades. Governments running deficits, businesses taking on huge loans, people piling up credit card debt.
Yeah, it's like it's become the norm.
Exactly. This debt-fueled growth is everywhere. It's like everyone's hooked on borrowing, from governments to corporations.
So the book is saying this reliance on debt is actually messing up how capitalism is supposed to work.
That's the core of his argument. When governments keep bailing out failing businesses and manipulating interest rates to keep the debt flowing,
Yeah.
it creates this thing economists call moral hazard. Basically, businesses and individuals take on more risk because they know the government will probably step in if things go bad.
It's like a safety net that encourages risky behavior.
Exactly.
It reminds me of the 2008 financial crisis, those banks taking on crazy risks with subprime mortgages because they thought they were too big to fail.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. They knew if things went south, the government would probably bail them out.
And they did.
Yep. Trillions of dollars pumped into the financial system.
It did prevent a total collapse,
But
but
it reinforced this idea that the government will always be there to clean up the mess.
and that just fuels the debt addiction even more.
Exactly. So instead of letting the market work naturally, allowing weak businesses to fail.
We end up with a system where taxpayers share the risk, but the profits go to the top.
You got it. And that's a big reason why people, especially younger generations, are losing faith in capitalism. They see a system that feels rigged against them.
It definitely feels like we're at a crossroads. This whole idea that government intervention is actually making things worse for capitalism, it's really eye-opening.
Right.
I'm really curious to see what solutions he proposes. What does he think we should do? Like, what does less government, more market actually look like?
Well, that's what we're going to dig into next.
I'm ready. Okay, so less government, more market. How do we actually make that happen?
Well, it's more than just a slogan, right?
Right.
One of the big things the book digs into is fiscal responsibility.
Okay.
Governments need to get their own finances in order.
Meaning.
Tackling that debt addiction, the overspending. It's like, think of it like your personal budget.
Okay.
You can't just keep racking up credit card debt forever. There are consequences.
That's true. But what about the argument that governments need to spend money to stimulate the economy, especially when things are tough?
He doesn't say government spending is never necessary,
Okay.
but he's cautious about relying on it too much.
Makes sense?
All those stimulus packages, the bailouts, it creates a cycle of dependency,
Ah, I see.
and it messes with how the market is supposed to work.
So finding that balance, right, between supporting the economy when it needs it and letting the market do its thing.
Yeah, that's the key. And shifting the focus to long-term solutions, not just quick fixes.
Like what?
Instead of just throwing money at every problem, invest in education, job training,
Okay.
things that give people the skills they need for a changing economy. Or infrastructure, projects that create jobs and make things run more efficiently.
Right, those are more sustainable solutions. Getting at the root of the problem, not just putting a Band-Aid on it.
That's the point, creating an environment where individuals and businesses can succeed on their own, not because of government handouts.
Which brings us back to competition. The book really stresses that a healthy capitalist system needs genuine competition.
Yep.
But how do we get there? It feels like so many big businesses have this unfair advantage.
Well, he says true capitalism needs a level playing field,
Right.
where companies are competing based on how good their product is, how efficient they are, not who they know in government.
Okay, so how do we level that playing field then?
Deregulation. It's a big part of his solution.
Big regulation meaning?
Taking a good, hard look at all the regulations we have.
Right.
Figuring out which ones are actually protecting people and which ones are just making things harder for no reason.
I see.
Like, imagine you're a small business owner. You want to open a restaurant.
Okay.
You might have to deal with mountains of paperwork, permits, licenses, all this stuff that costs time and money.
Yeah.
It's a huge barrier. Gives an advantage to those big companies that already have the resources to deal with it all.
So cut the red tape, make things simpler, and that helps smaller businesses compete.
That's the idea. It's about empowering those entrepreneurs, letting new ideas come to life. He thinks that kind of environment, that's what drives real innovation, which benefits everybody in the end.
I could see that. But wouldn't getting rid of regulations lead to, I don't know, companies cutting corners, exploiting workers, harming the environment?
He gets that. It's a valid concern. He's not saying there should be no rules at all.
Okay.
There still need to be smart regulations, things that protect people and make sure businesses are acting responsibly.
Right.
It's about finding that balance, protecting the public good, but also letting the economy thrive.
A balancing act.
Exactly.
So we've talked about the author's ideas like tackling that debt addiction and getting rid of unnecessary regulations, but how do we actually put those into practice? Like, what are the concrete steps?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He admits there's no quick fix. It's about taking a long-term view, making changes gradually.
So where do we even begin?
Well, he keeps coming back to that debt issue. Governments need to get serious about their spending.
Right.
Get their finances in order. Like I said before, it's like your own personal budget. You can't just keep ignoring it.
That makes sense. But doesn't the government sometimes need to spend money to help the economy, especially during a recession or something?
He's not saying government spending is always bad,
Okay,
but he thinks we rely on it too much.
I see.
Like those stimulus checks, the bailouts, they can become a crutch,
Oh,
and they distort how the market naturally works.
so it's about finding a balance, right?
Exactly, and focusing on long-term solutions, not just quick fixes.
Can you give us an example?
Instead of just throwing money at a problem, invest in education, job training programs, things that give people the skills they need to succeed in the long run.
Right, those are investments in the future.
Exactly. Or infrastructure, projects that create jobs and improve things for everyone.
Makes sense?
It's about creating an environment where people and businesses can thrive on their own merit, not because of a government handout.
And that brings us back to competition.
Right. The author really believes that real competition is essential for capitalism to work.
But how do we get there if big businesses already have so much power?
He thinks a big part of it is deregulation.
Meaning?
Getting rid of unnecessary regulations that are just holding people back. Like, imagine a small business owner, they're trying to open up a shop, but they're hit with mountains of paperwork and permits and licenses, all this stuff that costs a ton of time and money.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a problem.
It makes it almost impossible for them to compete with those huge companies that already have the resources to deal with all that.
So if we simplify things, get rid of the red tape.
It levels the playing field, gives those small businesses a fighting chance.
I like that.
And it allows for more innovation, more new ideas, which ultimately benefits everyone.
But what about those concerns that less regulation could lead to companies cutting corners, like, worker exploitation or environmental damage?
He understands those worries, and he's not saying we should have no regulations at all.
Okay.
The key is having smart regulations, rules that actually protect people and the environment, not just a bunch of pointless bureaucracy.
Right, regulations that make sense.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot, protecting the public good while also letting the economy thrive.
It's a tough balance. This whole conversation has really shown me how complex these issues are. There are no easy answers.
You're telling me. But I think that's one of the book's biggest strengths. It makes you think, it challenges you to question things.
Yeah, it definitely does.
And hopefully it sparks some conversations about how we can build a better economic system, one that works for everyone.
I think that's a great goal. Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for all of you listening. Don't forget to check out What Went Wrong with Capitalism if you want to explore these ideas further. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.